like to acknowledge the traditional territories on which you may be. Just a reminder for those joining us to please mute themselves. S'il te plaît, mettez-vous en sourdine pour les personnes qui ont pas un moment. I'm getting a little bit of feedback. Just a reminder, please mute yourself. Parfait, merci. I have with me today the Honorable David Lametti, Minister of Justice, Attorney General of Canada, the Honorable David Eby, Attorney General of British Columbia, Doug White, Chair of the BC First Nations Justice Council. To start this event in a good way, we are joined by Elder Bruce Allen, and we are also joined by Mike Peters, Director of the BC First Nations Justice Council, who will perform the Salmon Song and provide closing remarks. We'll then have the opportunity to hear the short opening remarks of each our guests, and we'll go into a QA session. Just before I turn it to opening prayer, just last reminder to please keep yourself muted and have your cameras off unless you're one of our speakers today. I would now like to turn to Elder Bruce Allen for his opening words. Elder, you're on mute.
Adi Bandara Hunzu, Si Bruce Allen, Stalaten First Nations, Ihasia. Good morning, everybody. My name is Bruce Allen. I come from the Stalaten First Nation, and I'm honored to be part of this important announcement. I currently work with the College of New Caledonia, and I work with Indian residential school survivors. And I'm a residential school survivor myself. I'm an intergenerational survivor. My grandmother attended Lee Jack, my father attended Lee Jack, and my father also attended the Kamloops residential school. And I'd like to acknowledge the Lheidli T'enneh First Nations whose unceded territory I live and work on in Prince George. And so along with the many teachings of the elders, we also have with the justice system, it's probably an extension of the residential schools and the 60s scoop. We have a lot of people in the justice system as a fallout of the residential school. But healing is really important for me. So when you look at the picture behind me, it's in that at a healing camp location in my territory called Ormond Lake. And so a lot of our survivors do go there, and intergenerational survivors do go there, including those ones that were incarcerated and such. So I'll just open with a prayer, and then I'll sing one of our clan songs. I belong to the Beaver clan. So, Creator Grandfathers, hear our humble prayers and prayers for all of the frontline workers with the BC First Nations Justice Council and all those people who work with Indigenous peoples in the justice system, including our honorable members of Parliament and legislature in Victoria. And prayers for a good meeting and all my relations. So this is my clan song. Oh yo ho ha, akanana kanana, yo ho ha, akanana kabasta. Yo ho ho, akanana kanana, yo ho ho. Oh yo ho ha, akanana kanana, yo ho ho, akanana kabasta. Yo ho ho, akanana kanana, yo ho ho ha, akanana kanana, yo ho ha, akanana kabasta, yo ho ho, akanana kanana, yo ho. Oh, yo ho ha, akanana kanana, yo ho ha, akanana kabasta, yo ho ho, akanana kanana, yo ho ho. Awetsa.
Thank you, Elder Bruce, for starting us off in a good way. Je sais maintenant la parole au Monsieur White, who will be saying a few words.
Siyam na siyaya, ain't the pet colossal tin tanis na nemo, ait na squalum konas ich heitzepka siyam stimo. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. My name's Doug White. My Coast Salish name is Colossalton. My new channel name is Cleishan. I'm the chair of the BC First Nations Justice Council here in British Columbia, and happy to be here with you all today to talk about this important announcement. This is a partnership that's been years in the making. A lot of work has led to today's announcement on the Tripartite MOU, which represents an innovative formalized partnership between Canada, British Columbia, and the BC First Nations Justice Council. I want to give recognition and respect to the leadership of our Attorney General in British Columbia, David Eby, and our Solicitor General, Minister Mike Farnworth, for joining in partnership with the BC First Nations Justice Council to undertake this work, and now Minister David Lametti, Attorney General of Canada, for joining us to bring to our approach a tripartite approach. This is very important leadership that is being demonstrated in this country. This is a critical first step to transforming the justice system and improving the outcomes for First Nations people in BC, but a lot of work remains to be done. After decades of damning reports, studies, and commissions that showed exactly where the issues are, we now have significant funding and the commitments to make real changes for the better in the lives of Indigenous peoples and their communities. And we're grateful for that. Prior to this agreement, there had been no meaningful progress in the last 30 years, and new stats show how bad it is today. According to the Office of the Correctional Investigator, the overall Indigenous inmate population is now at more than 30% of the overall prison population. Today's announcement represents a new era and a new shared commitment to reforming and modernizing the criminal justice system, which includes work to advance strategies to address systemic racism and the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples. Our work is guided by the First Nations, the BC First Nations Justice Strategy. Fully implemented, the strategy will reduce the number of First Nations people who become involved with the criminal justice system, as well as improve the experience of those who do. The strategy will also increase the number of First Nations people working within the justice system. We want to see more Indigenous lawyers, more Indigenous judges, and more Indigenous justice workers across the system. They can help change the system from within. The strategy also calls for the return and support of First Nations who want to restore their own Indigenous justice systems and structures. This restoration will be a long-term process that aligns with the standards set out by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Finally, with this partnership, we will expand our reach across the province of British Columbia with even more Indigenous justice centers, as well as increased capacity at each center. Next week, we have the official grand opening of our first 4 centers, and I hope you will all consider attending the event. Over the next 5 years, we hope to increase the number of centers to a total of 15 for the province. The Indigenous Justice Centers are on the front lines of justice system transformation. They deliver free legal services using a different model and one that is also culturally safe. We have staff lawyers who are ready to help and elders at each center to help guide and teach. We also deliver wraparound services that allow us to help Indigenous clients in other ways, such as referrals and community connections. The devaluation of Indigenous peoples in Canadian society must end. It is a colonial legacy that has produced systemic racism, alarming rates of violence, and the unacceptable growth of incarceration rates in federal and provincial corrections. From the over-policing of our people to the criminalization of structural poverty, we cannot commit to anything less than a massive overhaul of our justice system. To reach our goals, we must work together. We are inspired by the support we have received from the governments of Canada and British Columbia, and we look forward to building upon the unifying strength of this partnership. I want to acknowledge the hard work that's been done by many different people across all of the work over the last number of years, the former members of the BC Justice Council and current members. I want to particularly mention Gayleen Askelin, the Executive Director of the Justice Council, and Colleen Spear, the Executive Director in the Government of British Columbia that's leading this work there. Without their inspired leadership and hard work, we would not be where we're at today. So I want everyone, the media, to know in particular that we also see the media as our partner in this journey. Indigenous culture has always valued the storyteller, and we look to you to help tell our story. Thank you. Aitsepka.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur. Oui, maintenant, je cède la parole au ministre Lametti.
Hello, bonjour. Thank you, Doug. It's an honor to join you and Minister Eby for today's announcement, as well as our two elders, for whom I thank Elder Bruce for his opening prayer and Elder Boyd Peters for what is to come. Let me start by saying that I'm in Montreal, and so speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, as well as a traditional meeting place for a number of Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, and the Métis Nations. I think Doug hit the nail on the head. Today's announcements are critical first steps. They are concrete examples of how we are working in collaboration to transform the relationship between Indigenous peoples in British Columbia and the justice system, and hopefully this is something that we can scale across Canada. And I also think Elder Bruce raised an important point. Colonial structures such as the residential schools have an insidious way of replicating themselves across many other structures, including the justice system. And today we're trying to dial that back, scale that back, strip away the colonialism, which, as Doug has pointed out, has led to so much tragedy within our criminal justice system, and overrepresentation is one manifestation of it. Today's announcements demonstrate a clear response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to actions, particularly CTAs 31 and 38. Transformation is not just happening in BC, it's going on across the country, and it's the overarching goal of so much of what our government's work is. It also underpins our commitment to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It is clear in our efforts to address the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples, Black Canadians, and marginalized people in the criminal justice system, and it shows in our commitment to create a national Indigenous justice strategy developed with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. But let's talk about today. First, the Tripartite Memorandum of Understanding we have signed represents a renewed opportunity to work together on building a positive, healing future for Indigenous peoples in BC. And that means advancing our shared justice priorities, including addressing the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in the justice system and enhancing restorative justice and First Nations-led alternative justice programs. We will take an integrative, holistic, and comprehensive approach to address all forms of interactions between Indigenous peoples and the justice system. And all of this important work will be guided by the principles outlined in the UN Declaration. La Déclaration nous indique les étapes d'un changement à la fois profond et nécessaire aux relations entre la couronne et les peuples autochtones. Nous devons faire respecter les droits de l'homme, reconnaître l'autodétermination, combler les écarts socio-économiques, combattre la discrimination et éliminer les obstacles systémiques et le racisme auxquels sont confrontés les Premières Nations, les Inuits et les Métis. Je suis fier des progrès réalisés sur bien des aspects pour améliorer l'accès à la justice des peuples autochtones et réduire la discrimination systématique. This includes supporting broader implementation of GLADU principles in the justice system. It involves collaborating with Indigenous peoples to revitalize their legal systems. Call to Action 50. It means helping Indigenous families navigate the family justice system and access community-based family mediation. And we're learning from what you're doing in British Columbia. Our 2021 budget dedicated significant funds to launch the process of creating a federal Indigenous justice strategy. So as we work with the provinces, territories, and following the leadership of Indigenous partners to develop this strategy, the BC First Nations Justice Council's innovative and ambitious approach will certainly inspire our work ahead. And that brings me to the second part of today's announcement. I'm pleased to announce the Government of Canada will provide over $8.9 million over 5 years to the BC First Nations Justice Council to expand their Indigenous Justice Centre pilot project. Funding is the first pilot project to be approved under the Community Justice Centres initiative that was announced in our government's 2020 fall economic statement. Community justice centres, as Doug has explained, and Indigenous justice centres represent an innovative approach to justice. They move matters out of the traditional courtroom and into a community setting. They bring together justice and health, employment, education, and social services to collectively address the root causes of crime, break the cycle of offending, and improve public safety and community well-being. Through the integration of culturally appropriate services, CJCs can help decrease the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples, as well as other marginalized Canadians in the criminal justice system, and provide solutions to systemic issues. The funding is provided through the Justice Partnership and Innovation Program, JPIP, which supports initiatives that work toward our goal of ensuring an accessible, efficient, and fair justice system for all. This funding will also support the Council's virtual Indigenous Justice Centre, a unique web-based platform that provides remote legal services to Indigenous peoples across the province. This initiative is one of many that we're undertaking together, and we continue to take meaningful steps to transform Indigenous justice in BC. I greatly look forward to your continued partnership. Thank you, merci, and over to Minister Eby for further remarks.
Thank you very much, Minister Lametti. I'm joining you today from the territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people in Vancouver, British Columbia. A great honor to be here today. I want to begin by thanking Elder Allen for starting us in such a positive way today, and to recognize the leadership of Chair Doug White and Director Boyd Peters and all of the directors, past and present, of the First Nations Justice Council for your leadership in this remarkable initiative and for your partnership. And I also would be remiss if I didn't mention the leadership of Minister Lametti on this file. We've been working together for a while to arrive at this day, and I'm very grateful to him for stick handling this through, we were talking hockey before, so it's on my mind, for stick handling this through his various processes at the federal government level, and thank Prime Minister Trudeau and the Government of Canada for their support. You know, you've heard from Doug White the appalling statistics about the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in our prisons. I also find compelling the statistic that 48% of our youth in custody are Indigenous youth, and that the fastest growing population of those youth is Indigenous girls. We need to turn this around, and the question is obviously how. The programs and initiatives and reports to date have not been successful. And in my opinion, one of the main reasons for that is that they have been designed for Indigenous people, not by Indigenous people. And that is the big shift here. When we formed government, we signed an MOU with the First Nations Justice Council to develop a justice strategy in partnership. It was written by Indigenous people for Indigenous people under the leadership of the Justice Council, and it is now the justice strategy of the province of British Columbia. And with this MOU, the federal government is joining us, and critically important that they do. Federal prosecutors, federal prisons, federal government has responsibility for the criminal code and youth criminal justice. There are so many areas where the federal government has responsibility. It's only by working together on this justice strategy authored by Indigenous people that we can make true progress here. And that's why I think today is so significant. I want to let you know that we have been working on this for a little while here in British Columbia. The government puts $2 million a year into this program, and it's manifesting in Indigenous justice centers already in the province. The First Nations Justice Council has opened centers in Merritt, in Prince George and Prince Rupert. And during the pandemic, the Justice Council pivoted with the provincial government to open a virtual Indigenous Justice Center serving Indigenous people across the province virtually, whether online or by phone. And the results are already very positive. So for example, in Prince Rupert, the First Nations Justice Center there, through their supports, addressing the underlying reason why an individual is coming into contact with the criminal justice system, whether it's a housing issue, whether it's an addiction issue or a personal conflict, whatever it is, they work with that person to address the underlying issue. And through their work, they've managed to avoid, every person that's come through that justice center has managed to avoid a custodial sentence because the underlying issue is addressed. So if you're concerned about the rotating door of prisons, people in and out of prison, the cost and injustice that comes with that, the lack of community safety, this center is demonstrating that by addressing the underlying issues in a culturally safe way through First Nations Justice Center, we can begin to reverse these trends and provide real and positive results that improve community safety for everybody. And that's the really exciting part here. Other pieces that are quite innovative and remarkable that have taken place since signing this justice strategy at the provincial level is we transferred responsibility for GLADU reports. These are pre-sentencing reports for Indigenous people who are involved in the criminal justice system so that the judge can take into account their unique circumstances. Those are no longer administered through Legal Aid BC. Instead, they're administered through an Indigenous organization through the First Nations Justice Council. And the benefit of that is Indigenous services are being provided for Indigenous people by an Indigenous organization. And it's just part of the work to come. So we're transforming how the justice services are being delivered because there's an underrepresentation of Indigenous peoples on the administrative side of justice, as you heard earlier already. So it's wonderful and so positive to have the federal government involved in this work. This tripartite partnership will open many doors to addressing this ongoing human rights issue that we face and really an issue of injustice for too many people across our province. And it's my sincere hope that this will result in a model that other provinces can look to as the federal minister continues this work at a national level in partnership with the First Nations Justice Council and Indigenous organizations across the country. So thank you very much, everybody, for your work to bring us here today together, and look forward to hearing questions from the media.
Thank you very much, Attorney General Eby. I would like now to invite Elder Boyd Peters to perform the Salmon Song and his closing remarks.
Yes, thank you, Chantal. I really appreciate the announcement today for the tripartite MOU between for the BC First Nations Justice Strategy. Thanking Elder Bruce Allen for the opening prayer to help to ground us, to speak from the heart, and to talk about the healing that is required. Also thanking the Honorable David Lametti and the Honorable David Eby as well. And our chair, Doug White, Colossalton, from the BC First Nations Justice Council on your very positive remarks. And it's all about relationship building. I know that as the portfolio on the BC First Nations Justice Council for corrections and for policing, the disparities of our overrepresentation is enormous, and something needs to be done about it. And the announcement today of bringing in Canada to help with this work is really what's required, and we've been working on it for a long time here now, as Doug was saying. And I also appreciate, that Canada is going to be doing a federal Indigenous justice strategy, and for the contribution of 8.9 million over 5 years is very much appreciated. The BC First Nations Justice Council logo that we have is the salmon, and It really means a lot to us as Indigenous First Nations people that salmon, they persevere, they sustain our people, and it's a reciprocal and balanced relationship. And I think that kind of goes to show with the BC Canada and with our Justice Council, there's that relationship. And they are also teachers for life's journey. They are powerful and determined and purposeful in life's mission to trust and believe in. So I wanted to do the salmon song, which is really lively celebration song to kind of conclude today's session. Turn it back to Chantal.
Thank you, Mr. Peters. That is the end of the remarks portion of the announcement. We will now begin the QA session. Just a reminder to please use the raise hand function on your computers or *6 if you're joining us by phone. Nous allons maintenant amorcer la période de questions et réponses. N'oubliez pas de lever virtuellement votre main si vous avez une question ou utilisez *6 si vous nous rejoignez par téléphone. Et vous avez une question puis un suivi. You have one question, one follow-up. We will begin with Jeff Blagden. Please go ahead.
Hello, thank you. Jeff Blagden from CFNR Radio in Terrace. You mentioned briefly about the restoration of Indigenous justice and legal systems. I'm just wondering if you could expand a little bit more on what form that would take and how it's going to impact things like existing legal systems other places and people who are already kind of fighting charges from those systems.
This, maybe I can jump in and provide an answer to this. It's a very important question. The BC First Nations Justice Strategy that we crafted and signed back in March of 2020 with BC talks about two main pathways of work that we need to undertake. And on the one hand, it's reforming the existing justice system on pathway 1 to make it less harmful and more appropriate for Indigenous peoples. But the longer term second pathway, what we said was if we're being serious about the moment that we're in, about the UN Declaration and about recognition and implementation of rights, then the justice strategy has to create space and opportunity for Indigenous peoples. And this is their work. This isn't the work of the Justice Council. This is the work of Indigenous peoples to do. But we have to create the space and the opportunity for them to re-articulate their own approach to the justice system, to create Indigenous legal order, an Indigenous legal order and tradition-based justice system. So the immediate impacts are, you'll see that through things like more fulsome and better attuned Gladger reports that present elements of Indigenous legal order and traditions as sentencing alternatives to judges to consider, and in ways like that. But it will be a number of years before we see fully formed Indigenous justice systems. We talked about a number of years ago in 2018, the distinction that happens if you go to the southern part of the Coast Salish world in the United States. There are fully formed, if you go to Tulalip or Lummi, then what you're going to see there are fully formed Indigenous justice systems. It'll be Lummi judges in a Lummi court applying Lummi law. It's all Coast Salish law down there. But if you come to the Canadian side, that's just not been the way we've done things in this country for decades, for a very long period of time. So we've charted a course to enable that as a possibility down the road, but it's going to be still significant discussion and work to be done, and the majority of the work to be done by Indigenous peoples themselves.
Jeff, if I could just add, that's obviously part of our program. It was in Call to Action 50, the Truth and Reconciliation report and calls to action. We have begun as a government investing along those lines, and Doug has in a sense outlined the philosophy, which is they have to be Indigenous led. They have to be Indigenous based in terms of their traditions. So we have already invested in about 20 projects across Canada, roughly $10 million, 3 or 4 of those projects in British Columbia. And each of the projects is different, precisely because there are different needs on the ground for the projects that were developed by Indigenous peoples, the Indigenous communities themselves. So we'll continue to do that. Hopefully there will be further such investments as we move forward. And I think that revitalization that Doug is referring to, it can happen in many different ways, in many different forms across Canada, and as a federal government, we have to let those systems flourish.
Follow up, Jeff?
Yeah, just a quick one. I know generally government works with elected band councils in terms of working on stuff like this. Is there, and that has tended to, especially up in this area, led to a bit of division amongst a lot of people. Is there any sort of plans in this process to involve hereditary leadership in discussions for any of these legal changes at all?
We're in the BC First Nations Justice Council definitely engages across the board with First Nations. There's 200 different First Nations in British Columbia, or 200. Let me put it this way: there's 200 plus Indian bands in British Columbia, and there's about 25 different major Indigenous peoples, major groups of First Nations. We're in a very dynamic moment in this country's history where we're seeking to decolonize from the approaches that have been imposed upon us. And so right now we are in a space where there are elected chief and councils who do hard work, who are elected by their people, that have a mandate to advance and advocate for their people. And there's also traditional forms of governance and leadership that in many communities that continue to do the work that they've always done. That's who we are. We're in a dynamic, complex moment. And so our hope is that we're able to work with everyone together to advance and put forward shared and common pathways to a fundamentally different future.
Yeah, again, Jeff, just to follow up on what Doug has said, certainly as a federal government, and I'm sure Minister Eby would say the same thing at the level of the British Columbia government, is you do try to engage in the complex forms of both traditional and elected leadership, and that's the only way to move forward, as complicated as that is. There's never any one solution to any question, but it is something that I think we all have. We're all getting more experience at these kinds of collaborations, and hopefully we seize the moment, this historic moment, and we continue to push forward in a positive way.
Thank you. Now we're turning to Neetu Garsha.
Thank you very much. Just making sure everybody can hear me.
Yep, go ahead.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, so my name is Neetu Garsha. I'm with Global News. Minister Lametti, you talked about the way colonial structures like residential schools have a way of embedding themselves institutionally, and there seem to be a few places where that's more apparent today than through the Indigenous child welfare system. Can you and perhaps Attorney General Eby as well speak to what this announcement may mean for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children who are in foster care?
You're muted, Minister.
Yeah.
Sorry, thank you for that question, Nitu, and thank you, Doug, and Chantal for pointing out that I was muted. Look, we are trying to address the question on multiple fronts. So one is reinvigorating traditional justice systems, in this case through community justice centers, so that young people don't end up in the youth detention system. And another is through Bill C-92, which is brilliant in its intuitive simplicity, which is people should take care of their own kids. So recognize the right of Indigenous peoples to take care of their own children. They're the best place to do it. And then reinvesting in those structures through the leadership of Indigenous communities as they create or recreate the structures to take care of their own kids. So you try to keep people out of the sort of youth welfare system, try to keep children out of the youth detention system for more criminally oriented behavior, and work at the root causes that colonialism has negatively brought about. So you try to do all that once, obviously at the adult level, trying to do the same thing through community justice centers, through I have Bill C-5 in front of the House, taking out some of the minimum mandatory penalties, which have the ones we've targeted have historically touched Indigenous offenders much more than non-Indigenous offenders. So it's trying to do all of that, trying to do all of it at once. The key point in terms of methodology is working with Indigenous leadership and following Indigenous leadership such that we don't replicate the same colonial structures that we had before.
Go ahead, Doug.
Thanks, Minister. So this is a really important question. This is one of in terms of all of our work, the Justice Council was set up to do two things. One, deal with the overrepresentation of our people in jails, and two, deal with the overrepresentation of our children in care. And so the justice strategy itself has strategy 10, which emphasizes and focuses on prevention and youth. That we want to make sure that we don't want to just be helping and grappling with people that are already entangled and enmeshed in the criminal justice system. That's important work. More important, we want to help make sure that we keep children out of the criminal justice system. So there's a very sharp focus on that. As Minister Lametti talked, the justice centers themselves are designed to deliver the earliest possible legal services to families, to parents, to communities, to individuals that are grappling with legal challenges. So one of the challenges that we've heard from people is that, and what we've witnessed is that people don't get strong legal advice until it's too late, both in the criminal justice system and in terms of the child protection system. So those are two ways where we're looking through this work and this announcement today that are very directly aimed at supporting families and children, and doing the best that we can to get the supports in place at the earliest possible moment.
Thanks, Doug. And just quickly, I think in terms of the stream of having Indigenous communities assume jurisdiction and authority over various areas of law, the one that's the most advanced in British Columbia is in relation to the youth and care system. Minister Mitzi Dean has been working with a number of communities that are in the process of or have already taken significant jurisdiction over the youth child protection system. And so this is the direction, one of the key directions of the justice strategy, as well as Chair White pointed out. Thanks.
You have a follow-up, maybe, Nitu?
I do, yes, if I may. And if I could hear again from Attorney General Eby, Minister Lametti, and Doug again, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, because, Doug, it really stood out to me. You said prior to this agreement, no meaningful agreements were seen over the last 30 years, yet we heard a significant amount of promises from political leaders that those damning reports would be acted upon. And here we are 3 decades later, and much of that work has yet to be done. So while this announcement may seem encouraging to many, I want to get your thoughts on a timeline. So if I could ask the three of you, a year from now, what is one concrete change on the child welfare file that you are confident will be in place as a result of today's announcement and this MOU?
Thanks. Maybe I'll start. Minister Dean, through the Ministry of Child and Family Development, over the next year will be continuing their work with First Nations across the province around shift in authority and jurisdiction over First Nations children to First Nations communities. That work is ongoing and continuing, and you'll see more of that over the next year. And in terms of the First Nations Justice Centers, you'll see more of those opening, more parents receiving support earlier in the process through culturally safe environments that can respond to underlying issues and support them in getting services to avoid entering into the system in the first place, which is the goal that we all have, to make sure that the system is truly a last resort rather than a first resort. And I'll pass it over to Chair White.
Thank you. Very important question. This is the basic working philosophy of the Justice Council has always been to seek to take steps that will make a meaningful difference in the lives of our people as urgently, as frequently, and as meaningfully as possible. And so back in 2017, when we entered into an MOU with BC to craft a strategy in the first place, we said, we don't want to just sit around and talk for 2 years and develop a strategy. We need to start acting immediately. The crises that we're addressing require immediate action. And so we did start, the two main pathways were with respect to GLADU implementation and the development of the network of 15 Indigenous Justice Centers in the province. So I want to clarify and be clear about this work. It is very closely related, and it is aimed at dealing with the child protection system and child welfare system. But there's already really significant work happening by Indigenous peoples in this province. In this regard, Minister Lametti's talked about Bill C-92 and the recognition of jurisdiction. At the Justice Council here and through our work, while we have a broad mandate to deal with the overrepresentation of our children in care, we're trying to take a narrow focus where we can make adjustments, working with Minister Eby, working with Minister Farnworth and Minister Lametti, and also Minister Mitzi Dean, Minister of Children and Family Development here in BC, to figure out how can we best support families in the justice system that are grappling with child protection matters. So that you will see over the next year steps being taken in that regard.
Thank you, Neetu. On the federal side, obviously, in addition to what you've heard happening in BC, we would like to see more community justice centers. The pilot project funding we have is for BC, Manitoba, and Ontario, but we would certainly like to see more of that, and in particular in the next year in those 3 places. And with respect to children, more First Nations, more Inuit and Métis communities taking over the jurisdiction for caring for their children. We certainly have the leadership of Chief Cadmus Delorme and the Cowessess First Nation. Hopefully more leadership groups, Indigenous leadership groups, reasserting that jurisdiction and putting into place programs. And then obviously on the children, we'll have an agreement in principle with respect to the children who were removed or were otherwise discriminated systemically through the too narrow application of Jordan's principle, the agreement in principle that we have with the Caring Society that Minister Miller and Minister Haidu, myself, have put a lot of work into, and then hopefully we have investments moving forward in those areas so that we never replicate that again. All that in the next year.
Merci, Ministre Lametti. Un petit rappel, si vous voulez poser une question à nos invités, d'utiliser la fonction lever la main ou étoile 6. Reminder for those wanting to ask a question to use the raise hand function and *6. Mark Nielsen, go ahead.
Hi there, and thank you for taking my question. In Prince George, we have a First Nations Justice Center. We even have an Indigenous sentencing circle. I guess from that aspect, it seems like we're kind of ahead of the curve here. And was wondering what sort of further things might be coming down the pipeline, I suppose, as a result of this agreement in terms of, yeah, how things are dealt with here.
I'll start by responding to say that, so yes, Prince George was one of the first justice centers that we put in place. There's only 3 bricks and mortar justice centers in the province at this point, Prince Rupert, Prince George, and in Merritt. And so Prince George being a very important central hub of Northern British Columbia, we thought it good to start some of the work there. Now, over the course of the next number of years, we're going to be building out 15. In addition to the 3 bricks and mortar, we have the virtual Indigenous Justice Center, but there's going to be a network of 15 built. And over the course of every year, we expect the kinds of services that we're delivering through the justice centers to continue to expand and to deepen. So even though Prince George has a justice center and has had one for the last year or two, I would expect that over the course of the next number of years through the federal funding announcement today, the support from Minister Lametti and the Government of Canada of almost $9 million over 5 years, that some of those resources will be used to continue to deepen and develop the kinds of services that are being delivered through Prince George Justice Center. Thank you.
Follow up, Mark?
Yes, please. I know one of the concerns, I interviewed Mr. Eby when he was up here probably about a year ago about the strategy. And I know one of the concerns that was raised in the comment section below the story was, well, First Nations will be able to form their own justice systems. What would that mean for the way justice is dealt with in Prince George, particularly if it pertains to, say, a settler who is the victim of a crime perpetrated by a First Nations person?
Well, let me jump in quickly. This is one of the ways that we think about our work at the Justice Council is we try to understand for the most vulnerable in our society, what is the justice system doing for them and what are the gaps that we need to cover? So we think about a young Aboriginal mother in a remote rural community of British Columbia and how the justice system for her is a very elusive reality. That if she requires help or assistance because of, for example, domestic violence, that it may be multiple days before the police are able to respond. And so we know that's a significant problem. So there's not only is the justice system when it is being applied problematic, but in some cases there is no effective functioning justice system in rural and remote communities. And we know that because we've seen the work of Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond about systemic racism of major institutions in Canadian society, we know that it's almost always a risk for an Indigenous person to engage with those institutions. And so when we put in front of us the work that we have, how do we meet the needs of that individual that lives in that remote context? What is it how do we ever bring to that individual the sense of safety that they deserve, the sense of public safety, the sense of that there's a justice system that will protect them? And we know that the answer is she will never have the justice system that she needs until that justice system emanates from her own people, from her own Indigenous institutions. And so that's part of the answer to your question. The other part of the answer to your question, I think, is we can look by analogy to the American context where there's over the course of years, where in the United States this is an issue that has been dealt with for well over 100 years, for decades now at this point, the application of Indigenous law on reserves and how non-Indigenous people on those reserves are dealt with or not. We can see how systems develop, right? Canada is a complex country with cooperative federalism at the core of the idea of the Constitution, where there's multiple different jurisdictions that have to be recognized, respected, implemented, and coordinated. And so I have no doubt that through the work that we're doing together in partnership, we will be able to navigate those complex waters and develop a space where everyone in this country feels and it resonates with them that we have a meaningful functioning justice system that is fair and treats people fairly. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And I guess I would add that part of the answer is that there isn't any one answer, and that it will the manner in which we will protect will be largely similar. The manner in which we will address will be largely similar, but it will the traditional base or the federal criminal code base or the community base may very well have a different look depending, as I think Doug has pointed out, and that is going to have to be part of the solution, that there are pluralistic solutions to how we do it. They're going to be grounded in both Indigenous traditions and Western law, and we're going to have to work our way through that on a community by community basis.
If I might, I think, one of the goals that we all have is improved community safety for everybody, and so when I've seen the justice system working really well, it's around recognizing the individual and what they need, the individual who committed the offense, and what they need to stop offending. And in my experience with Indigenous legal traditions, which is admittedly not as much as I would like, but it's very focused on restorative justice approaches, looking at the specific person, their connection to the community, what they need to stop offending. And when I think about the traditional justice system, and when I've seen Indigenous offenders engaged in that system, I've seen a system that's very alienated from what they need. A judge who flies in, who they have no connection to, sentencing them potentially to a week in jail, and then they're back out during their time in custody. There's no opportunity for addressing the underlying issue that brought them into custody in the first place. And then they're back out facing the same issues that brought them into contact with the justice system in the first place. And this is not unique to Indigenous offenders, but it's particularly acute, I would say. And one of the benefits of even the sentencing court, which is the most minor intervention in the justice system, where there are some elders involved in the sentencing at these courts that we have, there's an accountability to the broader community, and there's an ability to bring into account in the sentencing a different approach and a different engagement with that person that potentially can set them off on a different route. So I think that the idea that some people have is that this might be easier, or this might be less consequence for someone who's committing offenses, but actually in most cases it results in more work, it results in more consequences, and a more potential for a positive outcome is what I've seen in restorative justice approaches that have a real Indigenous traditional aspect to them. So I'm really excited about what the potential is here, and we need to do better than we're doing right now. And I think taking a partnership approach with Indigenous people themselves and through the First Nations Justice Council is how we're going to get there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I don't see any more hands up, so that concludes today's press conference. Thank you for all those who've joined. Cela fait fin de la conférence de presse. Merci beaucoup à tous. Bonne journée.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Looking forward. Let's keep the ball rolling.
Absolutely.